Thanks for joining, John Gitong. Here's a public service announcement to our live audience. Remember to join in the discussion by posting your questions in the right-hand side of the screen for all our expert panelists. You may also join the conversation on socials by using the hashtag Route to Net Zero and hashtag Net Zero Asia. Let's welcome our third moderator of the day, Lau Xing Yi. Xing Yi is the Southeast Asia Green Finance Lead in the Carbon Trust Singapore office. She previously spent 5 years at a leading independent think tank, the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, as a senior policy research analyst, where she focused on environmental sustainability in ASEAN's resource sector. She's also actively involved in engagement with corporations and the financial sector with a view to drive sustainability and deepen cross-sector partnerships. Prior to this, Xing Yi worked at Sustainalytics, where she evaluated and benchmarked the environmental, social, and governance practices of publicly listed companies in 3 industries: consumer discretionary, food and utilities. Xing Yi holds a Bachelor of Science in Economics with a second major in Political Science, Public Policy, Development and Management from the Singapore Management University. She will be moderating the panel discussion, Net Zero Targets for Asian Financial Institutions, featuring expert panelists from Amundi Asset Management, Asia Investment Group for Climate Change, HSBC, Institute of Finance and Sustainability, China. Let's welcome Xing Yi.
Thank you so much, Wayne. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all friends joining us from various parts of the world. My name is Lau Xing Yi, and I'm the Green Finance Lead of Southeast Asia at Carbon Trust. Welcome to our panel on net zero targets and ambitious commitments, making this work for Asian financial institutions. I'm very pleased to be your moderator for this session. 2020 could be remembered as a game changer in global consciousness on sustainability. China, South Korea, Japan made net zero carbon commitments, while the EU introduced a European Green Deal for carbon neutrality by 2050. Achieving these ambitious commitments will involve both unlocking more financing as well as redirecting the capital flows towards green and sustainable activities. Various net zero initiatives have been introduced by industry groups to steer financial institutions towards more ambitious efforts and increase their accountability. Asian financial institutions are at this unique crossroads as they strive to be more aligned to international expectations, including net zero targets. They are also grappling with the responsibility to manage their carbon exposures and evidence concrete impacts through green and sustainable financing. And with this context in mind, I'm very pleased to introduce 4 distinguished speakers who will be sharing their valuable insights on this important topic. Our first speaker is Ms. Caroline Lemieux, Global Head of ESG Research, Engagement and Voting at Amundi Asset Management. She joined Amundi in 2019 and is responsible for the ESG Research, Engagement and Voting team. She was previously head of the long-term investment department at the pension division of CDC, which is the fiduciary manager of several French pension funds. She was notably in charge of the SRI strategy, ESG, and climate policy. We also have Ms. Rebecca Wright. She's the CEO at the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change, or AIGCC for short. Rebecca is the CEO of IGCC and AIGCC, and she's based in Sydney, bringing with her over 20 years of experience in climate change, sustainability, and investment banking. She's responsible for developing and delivering the strategy and implementation across AIGCC and IGCC, covering investor practice and policy advocacy. She is a member of the Global Steering Committee for the Climate Action 100 Plus and the Investor Agenda. Our third speaker is Mr. Calvin Tan from HSBC. Calvin has been appointed as the head of Sustainable Finance Investments ASEAN since 1st of September 2021. Before this, he was the Chief Executive Officer of HSBC in Thailand for the past 6 years, managing the bank's franchise for the country. He was responsible for overseeing and growing HSBC's wholesale and private banking business. And last but not least, I'm pleased to introduce Ms. Hu Min, the Executive Director at the Institute of Finance and Sustainability, IFS. Hu Min has almost 20 years experience in climate and sustainability and sustainable energy policies, research and advocacy. She has published articles and co-edited books on low-carbon cities. She's also China advisor for Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, senior fellow at Energy Innovation, and non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. Thank you, speakers, for joining us today. At the macro level, we have considered that mainland China, Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, and also Indonesia made announcements to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 or 2060 as part of their commitment to fight climate change. This is a step in a positive direction that will require more financing towards green and sustainable activities. Perhaps to kick us off, I'll have a question for Hu Min. How have you seen these signals influencing financing activities in the Asian markets?
Thank you, Xing Yi. It's a great pleasure to be part of the distinguished panel, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion with the audience. You asked a very great question. I think just an update about China's policy progress after China committed the carbon neutrality goal. Since then, the China's central bank have signaled a lot of potential policy progresses from the leader. For example, the PBOC governors has mentioned that China is going to renew the green finance standard system, including removing fossil fuel related projects from green bonds category and adding climate friendly projects. Like there will be mandatory environmental information disclosure. Actually, the document already issued in June, and it will be integrating climate change into risk management system of financial institutes. I think probably many people have seen that China announced will be no coal power plants around the BRI countries. And as a follow-up action, the Bank of China already committed they wouldn't be financing new coal power plants. Also, as the whole system of of China's carbon neutrality strategy framework, we're expecting, as China's leadership has mentioned, that we're expecting so-called 1+N policy system. The first one will be an overall strategic framework, and under that framework, there will be different action plans and policy documents from each sectors, and including a financial policy action plan supporting China's carbon picking and carbon neutrality goal in long term. So there's some discussion leaked already showed that there will be monetary policy tools that will support projects that can produce direct mitigation in short term. There will be a so-called national transition fund being discussed, and there will be also, of course, important thing, including green loan into MPA system, and there will be favorable low-cost loan to the green projects. So I think specifically, if I'm looking at the future policy trend, of course, the first important document we are still expecting is the guiding strategy from the central bank regarding how financial policies and financial system will be able to serve China's carbon picking and carbon neutrality goal. That specific policy document will be something very important if it comes out in future. And I think specifically there will be we will need a taxonomy revision of China's green finance system, because there will be new projects included. There will be some projects removed. And of course, the specific green finance monetary finance tool that could provide and mobilize social fund into the field, that will be very important. And a big discussion right now going on is about the transition finance system in China, whether this because I think the huge challenge is not only increase the total amount of green finance in China, but also it's very important to decarbonize the financial institute existing current investment portfolio. So having investment into namely the dirty industry, however, with higher environmental standard requirement and with direct mitigation goals, that could be also quite important to help China transit to the low carbon development path and the carbon neutrality goal. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Humin. You have shared really interesting insights and also very important developments that could be very game-changing in the sustainable finance landscape. And in fact, we see how sustainable finance is gaining traction, not just in China, but in many parts of Asia. And that's because a lot of banks and investment companies are providing more disclosure on their sustainability journey today. Now that we are generating a lot more sustainability data out there, what are some areas that Asian banks and the investment community should focus on to start aligning themselves to international expectations? And for that, I'll turn to Rebecca. If you could share with us some views or some tools or frameworks that we can use from AIGCC's perspective.
Thanks, Xing. Yeah, I think what we've seen with the investment community, we've really seen this proliferation of net zero initiatives come through in the last 6 to 12 months. So we have the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, which is one of the fastest growing initiatives that we've seen now, with around 148 investors globally and a number in Asia, representing nearly half of all global assets under management. And there is also an equivalent net zero asset owner commitment as well. But really, these commitments are really asking investors to allocate a proportion of their investments and identify that publicly, that they are committing to net zero, and then to ratchet that proportion of investments over time, which mirrors the sort of the Paris process of ratcheting up over time till ultimately the whole portfolio is aligned to net zero. And so these are some of the new initiatives that are coming out, very recently, that investors are working on. But there are other initiatives, of course, like the Climate Action 100 Plus, engaging with the largest greenhouse gas emitters, that has been going for some years. Again, on that engagement side, so investors engaging with their investee companies, and again asking how they're going to transition to a low carbon economy going forward.
That's great, Rebecca. I really like your point around engaging with the largest greenhouse gas emitters, because this is really such a hot topic, especially in Asia. And one of the topics, in fact, that has always consistently made news headlines is the whole idea of what does the post-COVID economic recovery looks like. And one of the recent news articles spoke about a surge in demand and prices for energy everywhere. Like in Europe, we are seeing that the soaring wholesale gas prices have encouraged more utilities to be switching to coal to generate electricity, just as the region is trying to wean the countries of this high polluting fuel. And when we look at Asia, coal demand from major markets like China and India have also increased as their economies restarted after the pandemic-induced slumps. And one of the interesting quotes I found from those news articles is from the European Union's head of climate change policy, that made this comment about returning to coal amid the energy crunch will be considered a climate tragedy. So if I may turn to Caroline, who sits in Europe, from your perspective, with the coal industry contributing to sizable employment opportunities, how can we try to develop a constructive approach to phasing out coal investments while managing the social implications in Asia? Caroline, over to you.
Yes, I think there's two angles. First is stop financing new coal capacity. It's true that the new trend, and for example, when we engage with Asian banks or Asian insurance, we are asking them to to stop financing or insuring new coal capacities, because we don't need more capacity. So that is the urgency to stop financing the new capacity. And after, you have the coal phase out. And the coal phase out, depending if you are OECD country or non-OECD country, is not the same timeline. So for us, for example, we are backing the timeline of the International Energy Agency, which is phasing out from coal in OECD country by 2030 and non-OECD country by 2040. But it's true that it takes time and it needs planification. But it takes time to smooth out and try to work to find a solution that does not have too much negative social impact. And it's really important because, first, if there is a high social impact of this phase out, it would be counterproductive, because we need social acceptability. And secondly, as an investor, we need a smooth phase out in order to make sure that we keep our growth targets. It's really important altogether to work. I think part of the problem with the coal is because we need to discuss more about solutions that have the same cost, that have a neutral or even a positive social impact. And I think we need to develop this kind of best practice sharing.
That's really helpful, Caroline. And I think, where we want to learn a bit more from Amundi's experiences. How do you see some of these challenges, and how has Amundi, in your experience, been working with some of these companies towards net zero? What can we do in the coming months?
Okay, so we have increased a lot our engagement with issuers on the coal policy, but on net zero at a world, but on coal policy in particular. It's really important for all the people to understand how this net zero asset owner alliance, this net zero asset manager alliance will have an impact on what we will do in the coming years. First, when you are signing this kind of alliance, you committed yourself either to increase the number of asset under management who will be net zero, or you commit yourself to decrease your the carbon footprint of your portfolio to a certain percentage. What does it mean concretely in our portfolio? It means that either the issuers we are invested in do the decrease of their own carbon footprint, or we will have to divest at some point. So it will have a huge impact. That's why we are increasing our engagement efforts to explain that it's really important and that we have the same goal. When we engage more specifically on the coal, we try also to listen to the bottlenecks, because depending on the countries, some issuers, they have contract with their own governments. If their own governments are not they are not stopping coal by 2040 in some countries, utilities will have some problems. So we are engaging to understand the bottlenecks, to make to foster discussion even on this country, because we need to increase the level of discussion. What are the solutions? How we can do? So that's why we first want to engage. But it's true that at some point, because we are committed to phase out at some point, if the system doesn't phase out, we will have to divest at some point. That's why we are increasing the level of engagement, to make sure that we put all the effort to make sure that we can keep investing in those issuers. And at the same time, we are developing a lot our effort to finance the green assets, because this is also the other way around, mainly through green bonds.
Excellent, Caroline. I think you made really good points around how do we engage and at the same time listen, because we need to recognize the local context and the local challenges. And I think with this in mind, it reminds me that AIGCC had also launched the Asian Utilities Engagement Program. It is a new thing that was introduced in June 2021 and was in partnership with 13 institutional investors and stewardship service providers. So, if I can turn to Rebecca, could you share with us what's unique about this program and what can the program achieve?
Sure, thanks, Xing Yi. Yeah, so I mean, as we understand, you know, the Asian electric utility sector is so critical to this net zero transition, given that it contributes nearly a quarter of global carbon dioxide emissions, and the different challenges that we have, you know, with the sector, and Carolyn's alluded to some of those, and engaging with some of these companies. So really, this engagement initiative was brought around to increase the effectiveness of engagement with these focus companies through a common agenda, shared objectives, and this collaborative investor effort with, you know, really consistent and long-term objectives, which sends a very powerful signal that investors are asking for and expect companies to respond to climate change and understanding how they're undergoing the transition. So we started with 5 key investor expectations of companies in the utilities sector that we set out in a guide last year. And they are looking at the governance, climate governance of the organisation, how that flows through, you know, what is the decarbonisation strategy, including scenario stress testing of that company, obviously clear transparency and disclosure through the reporting that the company does of their underlying actions, and also resilience aspects that climate change will bring to their particular assets. And then also the public policy component, and how the company is involved in the public policy, and advocating through their industry associations and so on. And so we chose, and then we had a methodology to choose the sort of the 5 companies that we're focusing on at this point in time. And this is in parallel but complementary to the Climate Action 100 Plus program, and obviously finding other companies. And really, you know, so it was just to, and we, you know, the similar objectives of climate action as well, and really investors, you know, showing that public support, and you know, the engagement is in relatively early stages at this point, but very encouragingly, you know, we've obviously seen from CLP has already announced a net zero by 2050 commitment and a coal phase out by 2040, and that was some good timing on our part, and in terms of the early stage of the initiative, and obviously where the company was up to in reviewing its commitments and so on. So the timing was good there to really highlight investor expectations around what they expected there. And then also we've seen Tanaga as well with a net zero 2050 commitment. So it's really to, you know, and we'll publicly support in the companies in how they're progressing, because we really want to encourage that partnership and engagement with investors, you know, is that real partnership. And we bring in international investors and investors from the Asia region to ensure that we're bringing in the best knowledge and experience that we can bring to these engagements. And the companies are really, you know, appreciating the broad global perspective that this provides, bringing in international case studies, looking at the you know, sector progress globally, and really working through that sort of sector decarbonisation. And there's a lot of similarities with the Climate Action Program and how we bring in that sector decarbonisation work into this initiative as well.
That's great. And I think you pointed out a very important area around how do you look at decarbonizing the sector with utilities playing such an important role in many Asian economies. And really beyond what we have discussed around energy utility sectors, we see that Asian financial institutions in general do have significant exposure to clients in other carbon intensive sectors. And they also serve a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises. A critical success factor for a lot of these financial institutions in terms of achieving their sustainability goals will then in turn depend on the effort and the progress of their clients. If I can turn to Kelvin from HSBC now, do you have any advice for us or any past experience engaging with clients from these areas, and how can we help to lower the barriers to access green and sustainable financing?
Yep. Thanks, Xing Yi. So at HSBC, actually, our ambition is to be the leading bank for transition, you know, to net zero, right? And I think this ambition cannot be achieved without the support of our customers. So we are thus committed, to supporting them, in terms of sustainable financing and investments. While more and more companies, as my fellow panelists are saying, it realizes the risk and opportunities for that climate change presents. We still see that there's a lack of awareness, in some companies here, especially in Southeast Asia, in terms of, and many of them have yet to commence on the sustainable journey. So as financial institutions, it is actually a key role that we play, in terms of raising client awareness and knowledge on how climate change and low carbon transition could affect them, so that they can start to plan ahead to ensure that their business models are resilient, sustainable, and to capture new opportunities. Many financial institutions that we talked about, specifically to your question on carbon intensive sectors, actually are focused on working with these companies already. And we do see from our customers' point of view that they acknowledge this, that the transition risk is obvious, and they are taking steps for their sustainable journeys and working with financial institutions and other key stakeholders to co-create sustainable financial solutions. But as they say, the devil is really in the details, right? But I believe that there's really a strong sense of awareness, and more importantly, a willingness to make significant changes. Rebecca talked about CLP and Tenaga and all that, making commitments and all that, and we do see that. However, it is important that financial institutions must realize that it's also equally important to create awareness and take the SMEs, the small and medium-sized companies, and our customers along with this transition journey. SMEs actually make the vast majority of firms in Asia and provide the majority of employment. It is the backbone of economies, and their pivot to sustainable development is thus actually imperative. So just to give you some examples, that you asked for, so we launched, in last year in March, the Singapore first green loan proposition to tailor for SMEs, and the whole purpose is to actually reduce the barriers, as you have asked, and by doing so, what we do is that we are reducing time, complexity, and cost typically associated with applying for green loans for SMEs. And what we are doing is that we are drawing existing certification from the Singapore industry authorities to certify the validity of specific green projects and assets. As we speak now, we are also working with, and a couple of financial institutions are also working with Enterprise Singapore to roll out new government schemes called the Enterprise Financing Scheme Green, where the scheme provides 70% risk share to catalyze lending for emerging green growth sectors to develop technologies and solutions contributing to the reduction of waste, resource use, and greenhouse emission. I think probably one of the good example that I would like to share with you on how financial institutions support customers through the transition process, from an end-to-end process from global companies to SMEs, is how we are currently working with Walmart in decarbonizing its supply chain through the Walmart Sustainable Supply Chain Financing Program. So Walmart actually needed a bank to establish and administer a suppliers financing program where tiered pricing is provided to its suppliers to drive the achievement of sustainability goals as part of Walmart's overall ambition to remove as much as 1 billion tons of greenhouse gas from their global supply chain by 2030. So this tiered pricing actually is linked to and aligned to the supplier sustainability ranking. And HSBC is administrating and providing this financing for them. So in the end, it's actually a win-win situation where we work with our clients to support the whole ecosystem of a global supply chain, ensuring that the net zero ambition is achieved from end to end, from scope 1 to scope 3. And I think that's important, right? Because,
Yeah, I think you raised a good point around looking at the entire supply chain, working with the client so closely, and also trying to reduce the administrative burden of extending green loans to SMEs. And I think that was really a very commendable effort on HSBC's part. You also mentioned this at the start of your speech. You said that HSBC is looking at net zero, and I think looking more closely into the targets, HSBC mentioned that you are committing to become net zero in operations and supply chain by 2030 and in finance emissions by 2050. So from HSBC's perspective, how far do you think differentiated strategies are needed in ASEAN markets to deliver on HSBC's net zero commitments. Are you able to point us to some solutions or initiatives to accelerate the transition to a low carbon future in this part of the world?
Yeah, I think that's $1 million question, right? But yeah, but first of all, to put things in perspective, I think one has to acknowledge that Asia plays a pivotal role in terms of the global climate change, fight to global climate change. I think more than 80% of incremental global emission since 1990 actually comes from Asia. And Southeast Asia, ASEAN in particular, is extremely vulnerable in terms of climate change. Of the 10 cities that's vulnerable to rising sea levels, 4 actually are from ASEAN. But however, ASEAN is also the home of the world's fastest growing economies, right? And the region is expected to be equivalent to the world's 4th largest economy by 2030. So despite COVID-19, the region is still undergoing rapid economic growth and urbanization. Populations are still aspiring to catch up from a lower to middle income living standards, and therefore energy demand is still rising. So there is actually a need to balance this whole economic growth with our overall climate ambitions. Our experience in emerging market tells us that we need actually a very different approach that's required for ASEAN. The solution cannot be to curtail the region's growth. Rather, it is to find a way for the region to grow sustainably and to transition to a low carbon economy more effectively, leveraging on lessons already learned and innovations from other parts of the world. I mean, Europe is a good example. I mean, the transition pace is way ahead of this, and I think we can learn from them. A few key considerations, that ASEAN may want to consider in terms of the decarbonisation pathway is to look at timelines. I think my fellow panelists have talked about this. So ASEAN's focus will be setting long-term transitions, right, plans consistent with net zero by 2050 and in some countries 2060. I think it's a journey we all agree. It's not an immediate solution, but we all need to play a part in it. The other thing is that there should be acceptance and adoption of new source of energy and technology. For instance, natural gas could play a much more greater role instead of coal in this part of the region, right? We also need to see greater investments in renewable energy and faster adoption of greener technologies, not only in utilities, but in transportation, in infrastructure, logistics, and agriculture. Carbon emission thresholds should be set for different economic activities, but these depends on availability, accessibility, and affordability of the technologies. So, albeit it is a differing approach, it is critical that ASEAN transition pathway is science-based and credible, because the credible transition pathway will enable and facilitate the channeling of global financial flows into the region, which is actually crucial. There is a huge need for us to actually, as financial institutions, as banks and all that, to try and finance, this transition pathways.
Thank you so much, Calvin.
Yeah.
You wanted to continue something?
Well, I mean, specifically, just to give an example for HSBC in terms of, what we're trying to do at the moment, it's a multi-pronged approach. We engage, in the ecosystem in terms of governments, to share best practices, relevant policies and all that to make sure that corporates have basically the access to necessary financing. Just to give another example is that we also coming out with innovative solutions and, to look at sustainable infrastructure. We all know that there's significant financing gaps in terms of infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure in Asia. So recently we announced that we have launched a 150 million seed funding platform in partnership with Temasek. Its aim is to actually unlock as much as $1 billion of private sector investments to support sustainable infrastructure financing. And this platform actually is over the span of next 5 years. It's alongside with ADB, the Asian Development Bank, and Clifford Capital's holdings, and is to target renewable energy, storage, water and waste solutions, and sustainable transportation needs. So I think we all need to contribute to the journey of transition. Yep.
Thank you so much, Calvin. This is really helpful, and I think you point out a very good point around, how do we work with other stakeholders, like Temasek, ADB? How do we ensure that the impact is scaled up and at a more ambitious level? And I think all these things are important steps to ensuring that ASEAN is on track to the low carbon transition. And if I could shift now the lens from ASEAN to China. I wanted to ask Hu Min a question around, you mentioned all these efforts by the Chinese government and the central bank. Moving forward, to what extent do you think governments should be introducing more regulations to accelerate that momentum on sustainable finance in Asia? And what are some areas that you anticipate more regulations to be helpful?
Thank you, Xing Yi. I think if we look at Asia, even though China has committed not to build new coal power plants, but there are still many projects in the pipeline, and there are still a lot of projects which might not be the greenest as we hope going on. So I think for China's business activity, especially investment activities in the main Asia countries, is still a lot to do to really improve the environmental performance. I think collaborating with other countries is not only at project level, but also at policy and strategy level. From my personal point of view, I think somehow it's for financial institutes, they always respond to the need from the recipient countries. But if the recipient countries' sectoral policy are not the best, with the highest environmental standards, energy efficiency standards, and requirement and policies, that their business activity can only follow the local requirement. But in some areas in China, for example, the energy efficiency, renewable energy policies, China already have a quite advanced progressive system in own country. So I would suggest, if by all means, with maybe the financial institute help or other help from the government, that we could have more collaboration on that level, strategy level, on certain clean energy policy, green industry policies that could, respond back to influence the financial institutes' behavior change. I think domestically within China, again, it's also we need to have better linkage between the financial actions and the sectoral policies. I think one case you might have seen that we had some actions that to try to control and reduce the investment to coal power plants and fossil fuel electricity generation, and then there is electricity crisis, supply shortage, and there's the energy crisis problem around the world. Somehow, I think having more market-based instrument, letting the business owners to make more sustainable decisions is much better than the command and control policy that the government normally prefer doing. With that, I think it's government and regulators still have a lot to do to really build the level playing field to make these sustainable finance activities happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hu-Min. I think those are really great insights, and as you said, regulators play an important role. How do they create that level playing field? How do they ensure that they also create an environment that also empowers market players to leverage on some of these green and sustainable financing options, and also to pivot towards more sustainable practices? And so with the remaining time, I would like to turn to questions from the audience. I have a question here around how can financial institutions strike a balance between providing green sustainable financing while at the same time mitigating the rising risk of greenwashing. And I think when we say greenwashing, we are saying how do we avoid the risk of making exaggerated claims on environmental benefits when they don't exist. I could perhaps direct that question to Caroline.
Yeah, thank you. I think that the first thing is to maybe speak about what is greenwashing, because sometimes financial institutions are accused to be a greenwasher because they are exposed to a sector like oil and gas or materials or utilities. The thing is, what we all want is the transition towards a low carbon economy. But I mean, the economy, oil and gas companies, utilities are part of the economy. And what we really want is having a real life impact. So meaning that those sectors do their own transition. And to do so, they need us to be with them, and they need us to push them somehow in the right direction. So it's not because we are exposed to the sectors that we are doing greenwashing. So what we need to do is finance the green assets, but also push the companies that are in sector heavily exposed to the energy transition and having a high carbon footprint to do their own transition. And it's really important, and we also have to recognize that those companies might have a deep pocket and it could be investor in those green assets either. So what we should, that's why we need to disclose what we are doing and why we are doing, and this is the only way external stakeholders can assess if we are a greenwasher or not. But it's not because you are exposed and we are a greenwasher. And it's really important to make the differences between both.
Yeah, and I fully agree with you how we are, in fact, working through different channels in Asia, through governments, through stock exchanges, trying to promote the importance of sustainability reporting, because with more data, this is how we are able to get a good understanding of what is happening in terms of the company's current status and also future strategic plans, which also goes back to Humin's point about how do we look at strategy as a very important touch point to transform the entire company and industry. And another question from the audience is, in the UK, there is a lot of buzz and commitment, especially in light of COP26. So is ASEAN collaborating with the UK or other parts of the world for capacity development of stakeholders and impact creation on all ends? Is there any focus on collective growth? And I can direct that question to Rebecca.
Sure, thanks, Yi. I guess this is what these COPs do. They're a really pivotal moment to bring all actors together, not just governments. And we're now seeing that the investor community especially is more involved in these discussions than ever. But all actors, all members of the finance community, industry as well. And so what we are seeing, and others may be able to speak to specifically what ASEAN is doing sort of with the UK, but certainly, we're seeing, a heightened level of collaboration. We collaborate with our global investor networks from all regions. And there are all these race to zero initiatives and net zero initiatives that have sprung up that cover all facets of the financial community, including banks, consultants, insurance companies. So we're really seeing this collaboration in a way that we've never before seen this. And then we're coordinating at an international level, and then we're bringing that down to the regions for that local implementation. And then at a sort of a policy and a regulatory level, we're seeing a group called the Network for Greening the Financial System, which coordinates central banks and regulators at a global level. And I know ASEAN is very actively involved in that. And again, it's kind of looking at the sort of the global climate scenarios that are created through that group, and all ASEAN nations are involved in that. And then it's about, again, that local market implementation, stress testing the financial systems locally. So we're seeing this happen across the board through all sectors and all actors, and companies as well, and industry have their own, global collaborative initiatives. So I think that puts us, in the position we need to be. But again, this focus on 2030 is very clear for this COP, and that's what everyone needs to work towards in this really critical decade for this COP, but obviously thereafter in the implementation.
That's really insightful, Rebecca, and I'm really glad that we are seeing so many different areas of activities in this landscape, all moving us towards the net zero targets, and also ensuring that we are on track to this low carbon transition. And so, perhaps to conclude our panel, I would like to turn to each of my speakers. If you could give me perhaps a summary or some tips on what are some ways where Asian financial institutions, amid all these different developments, can continue to serve as a force for positive change in the future? If I can start with Caroline, then Rebecca, Kelvin, and finally Humin.
Okay, I think the key point is knowledge sharing, discussion, and collaboration. That will make us find the solution globally, but in Asia in particular.
I would totally agree with that. And just to follow on, I think it's an imperative for all investors now to act, no matter where you are on your journey of climate integration. The key is to act. And we do have an investor climate action plans. We have a framework that really sets out where investors and how they can go from whether you're a beginner to net zero, and really take you through that in a very step-by-step way, whether it's through your policy development, engaging with companies, your disclosure, and obviously the governance that you need to look at across your organization. So really, and again, this is a global collaborative initiative and something we want to normalize. So really the message is start acting, and there's plenty of tools and frameworks to help you on your journey.
Yeah, and the risks are sounding repetitive, but I completely agree. I think it's everybody's responsibility, right? So it's basically the active engagement with the governments and regulators, but we cannot just rely on government and regulators, right? It has to be top down and bottom up. So the financial institutions like banks have to play a part, but not only banks, insurance, asset managers, asset owners, because then they will change the mindset of corporates also, when they know that investors are actually demanding that they need to change. And obviously, I think we should all stay close to our customers to help them in the transition. I think many a times, people forget that, and they want quick results. But I think, we have to be committed to working with our customers to help them transition. Yeah.
I think to reach the net zero goal, we have the growth problem that we need to have more funding into clean industry, net zero industry. But the bigger challenge is actually the stock problem, that we have a lot of asset and investment in the high energy incentive sectors. I think I would hope and wish financial institutes to really tackle that problem, which is more challenging, and sometimes the market-based institutes might not like to work on that because it's very heavily regulated in several countries. That's the fossil fuel money is SOE or state-owned. It's very, very challenging. But I would really call for action from the financial institute to use your money power, use your boardroom power, to engage with this business to decarbonize their business activities. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Caroline, Rebecca, Kelvin, and Humin for this thought-provoking discussions. You have all done a fantastic job of explaining how can we transition to a low-carbon future through finance, and also work towards credible net zero targets. And I think more importantly, a point that comes through many of your conversations is how do we engage in a more constructive manner to listen not only to our clients in carbon intensive sectors, but also to look at lowering the barriers for the small and medium-sized enterprises, which make up the majority of the business community in Asia. And so this brings us to the end of our green finance session, but I hope it will be only the start of more conversations to come on net zero targets and Asian financial institutions. Please get in touch with the Carbon Trust, and we will be very happy to explore how we can work with you. Thank you so much for your attention, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.